Hello, people. Welcome. Okay, well, there are people that are going to probably be throwing down some puns in the comments. So thank you, Steven, for the puns. How's everybody doing? I assume people can hear me. Okay. Okay, good. I'm making sure that people could hear me because it's hard for me to know exactly how the feed's working. So anyway, so welcome for those that know what you're here for, which is podcasting a Q&A. And those that don't know what you're here for, that's also what you're here for, which is a podcasting Q&A. Some people may see this who are not fans of the show. So I will say what this is all about. The Skiffy and Fanty show is a science fiction and fantasy and horror podcast. We cover all kinds of stuff, from everything from interviews to talking about movies to occasionally we talk about books and other things. And then we review bad movies usually once a month with alcohol because that's how you get through bad movies. We are a 3-time Hugo nominated finalist podcast, this being the 3rd year we've been a finalist. So that's kind of cool. So, so there'll be some comments I'll be responding to. Folks who are here in the comment section, please feel free to throw questions up at any kind of point. I'll kind of go over some stuff, but if any point in this you kind of want to throw something out that you want answered, you're free to do so. They can be serious or silly. It doesn't really matter to me. The whole idea behind this is just to provide people with something to think about in case they're interested in podcasting. If you're an author or other creative who wants to be on a podcast, or you're just like a podcast dork and you love the whole podcasting thing. That's really what we're here to talk about. So with that in mind, I am going to kind of go over some stuff. I want to get out of the way some of the really obvious things that a lot of people want to ask about. And so I'm kind of breaking this up into sort of 3 sections. We're going to talk about technology because almost everybody wants to know about the technology of podcasting, whether you are going to make your own or going to be a guest on some. That's a big thing that comes up. Then obviously things like making podcasts. And then for those who are creatives who might want to be guests on things, I'm also going to talk about sort of a little bit of like podcast etiquette, which I think we probably need to talk about more, but yet doesn't get discussed. So for those that are not familiar with what we do as a podcast, typically we're not video. This is a whole new fucking thing, cursing and all. But usually when we're making podcasts, I have a pretty specific setup. I use a Blue Yeti microphone. They also make a microphone called the Blue Snowball. I also have a Radius 2 shock mount. I know, such language. I know, it's such bad language. I use a Radius 2 shock mount. I have a Knox Audio pop filter and a Rode PSA-1 swivel mount / boom arm. And I also technically use my Bose noise canceling headphones, but honestly, it's only because I happen to have 2 pairs. It really has nothing to do with anything else. So that's kind of my setup, but most of that setup is stuff that I've kind of acquired over the past few years. So in general, I would say most people are not going to start with that much stuff. They're probably going to start with a microphone and a pair of headphones, and they'll kind of work their way up. That's kind of how I started. We started with really bad microphones in the early days. We started with, I think they were $25 when we bought them from the Skype store before Skype was bought by Microsoft. And they were not great mics, although the audio was surprisingly good for a headset. So in general, what I say about podcasting, if you're going to start a podcast or you are looking to get a microphone because you want to be on them, is really kind of start small and make sure that what you're buying is going to fit what your most immediate need is. The biggest problem I see with anybody trying to get into any of these newfangled tech things, whether it's YouTube video making or whatever, is the desire to like throw down a lot of money and buy expensive fancy stuff, and then you end up with a bunch of technology that in some cases you're never going to use again. And so with podcasting, it's kind of the same. I mean, if you're creative, having a reasonably decent mic setup is good enough. That's going to be fine for most podcasting situation and interview situations. For other people who are going to make podcasts, it's probably a good idea to start small and work your way up, because the reality is you might start making a podcast. It may not turn out the way that you think it's going to turn out. Maybe things that you just don't like it. You wanted to try it. It didn't really work out the way you wanted to, and you kind of want to move on. It's better to know that you didn't throw down like, $500 on like a mixer and all kinds of stuff, and then have that just be this sunk expense that you'll have a difficulty getting rid of unless you live in an area where you could sell all that stuff for reasonable prices. So in general, I would say that you just kind of want to start with a decent mic. For most people, that's probably something like a Blue Snowball or something in the same territory. And usually you can get those at a pretty decent price, around 50 bucks, sometimes a little bit less if they're on sale. And then you just need a decent headset. I'm currently using a earbuds only because I don't have audio coming into me. Typically, we don't do that because it leads to bleed out into the into all of the regular audio that you record. Since I'm not recording anyone's audio but my own, it doesn't really matter. There's not a lot of bleed out through this. Bob in the comments is saying they're using an Audio Technica AT2020, which is about 100 bucks. Yeah, that one's pretty good. Audio Technica does good work. I think that one's perfectly fine. The Blue Yetis are fine. There's tons of sort of in that $100 range that are pretty good. It also helps if you get a mic and you think you're going to use it for other things. So Bob's saying that you're using it as an internet DJ. I assume for like the really, really, really awesome, like hardcore EDM, like industrial style stuff, that's stuff that you can't quite tell is music. I'm just assuming that's what Bob's into. Probably not, probably different kind of music. But yeah, so something like that is perfectly fine. I would say like 50 to 100 bucks is probably around your budget that you're going to spend on sort of beginner technology. I would not be going into that $200 to $250 range. So, and I know that Joan's mentioning in the comments, right, that there's a podcast I listen to that is hard to listen to because the audio quality is really, really bad. That's a issue. There's probably a number of issues going on there. It's possibly the microphones. It's also possibly the way that they're recording. I'll talk a little bit about recording equipment, which will explain why our audio is decent for the fact that we do not have studios and none of us live in the same area and we can't record in the same spot. So just as a reminder, yeah, so 50 to 100 bucks, probably good for all the things you need. Get a pair of over-the-ear headphones that are decent. You do not need to get a pair of Bose. I just happen to have 2 pairs. Other things, pay attention to, you're probably going to get a condenser mic. There are dynamic mics. You're going to want a condenser. You're going to want most likely a USB mic. Those kinds of things. You're also probably want to look into getting a pop filter. So I'll kind of move my mic into the screen so people can kind of see. So this sucker in the front's the pop filter, and this part up here is a shock mount. Now pop filters aren't really that expensive, but you can actually just make one. There are a couple tutorials online where you just get like an old pair of nylons and a coat hanger, a wire coat hanger, and you can just make one that way. I recommend those just because of what are called the plosives, which is any of those like P sounds or just a lot of air coming out. And if you're pretty close to the mic, which you're going to be when you're making a podcast usually, you have a tendency to create that burst of air that's really annoying. But yeah, so for most folks, it's probably going to be 50 to 100 bucks as your starting cost. You can start cheaper, but it just means that you're sacrificing on audio quality. And I think that's something most people kind of want to avoid as much as possible without breaking the bank. Some podcasts have gotten away with very, very low quality stuff. So I know that there were a pair of TV writers and showrunners who ran a podcast, and they basically recorded on a cell phone in a car while they drove. The only reason they really kind of got away with it is because the content they were offering was pretty unique. But most people are just not going to get away with that. So beyond that is the technology, the software stuff. So the stuff we use is Audacity and Skype, and then we use a thing called MP3 Skype Recorder as our backup. The reason we do that is if you just record only the MP3 Skype Recorder, you get all of the junky stuff that comes out of Skype, when people talk over each other and you get roboticness. It's really hard to sort of deal with when the audio goes to junk, which occasionally happens, Skype being an imperfect tool. And so when you record in Audacity, you have your own individual audio, which is just going straight into your computer versus what you would get from Skype. When we started with Skype only and recording straight from the Skype audio, and that was not great. Skype does have a built-in recording function now. You can also use, we haven't been using it because sometimes that's a bit spotty, but Audacity's free. A lot of people also have GarageBand. That does work as well. Audacity, I find, is just simpler. It's really is almost as simple as plug and play, press record, go. It's just a lot easier system. We do all of our editing in that as well. And that just works. It works pretty much for what we need. And keep in mind, we're an independent podcast running a bunch of people across multiple continents and all over the United States. I mean, none of us live in the same state. Paul and I are the one exception because he lives in Minneapolis and I live up in Bemidji, but we're 4 hours apart, so we don't get to record together very often. So for us, using Skype for that many people is effective. For other people, you're probably going to want to switch over to things like mixing boards if you're going to be recording together, because it really is less useful to record on a computer. So the only other piece of technology I would say that you probably should get is if you have a laptop that you're going to use, or you are having issues with weird fuzzy sounds in your audio. That's most likely caused by the position of your USB mic to the power supply. So sometimes getting a USB hub, which are usually about $10 or less, creates that extra a little buffer. So on the subject of Audacity, Bob asked, so we each have Audacity running. Yeah, we each run our own Audacity for individual tracks, and we use those for the final running. So we stick them all in the same, and then we do all of the editing magic for those. It just makes for higher quality audio. So if folks have been listening to our podcast from like the early days to the last 3 or so, 4 years, I think, you'll notice a pretty significant uptick in the quality of the final product. Because we stopped using MP3 Skype recorder or any version therein to produce our final audio that we edited from. So that's what we use. But again, this is not the only way you can do it. You can do it with mixing boards and more expensive software. I just think that unless you're doing some pretty fancy stuff, Audacity is pretty darn good for almost anything you need it for. So yeah, so we did have a question from someone on Twitter about what to pay attention to when it comes to getting a microphone. I kind of answered this a little bit. This comes from @Dovlin Writer, and really what just comes down to, I would say, lean away from headset-oriented mic systems. So things like gaming headsets, that kind of stuff, I would just avoid. The mics on those sometimes can be good, but often they're just kind of meh. I would look at condenser mics, which is not going to be hard because most of the USB mics you're going to find, if not all of them, are going to be condenser mics. I would say if you're planning to record a lot, pay attention to mics that you can easily step up the equipment that goes along with it. So the Yeti is a good example because it just plugs into a whole bunch of different kinds of pieces. So the shock mounts, they make shock mounts specifically for the Blue Yeti. They make boom arms that fit it. They make it to fit a lot of different stuff too. But there are some mics that are maybe more set up for more traditional music recording. The Blue Yeti, you can record music, but I wouldn't say that the setup for this is really great for music. So I would say that's a good thing to watch out for. And then I would say if you're planning just to be a guest, I would go for something that's really hands-off and very much plug and go. So either Blue Yeti or Blue Snowball or something in that territory where it's just literally you plop it down, it's got its stand or whatever, you plug the little USB in and you're basically done and you don't really need to think a lot about it. That's the stuff that I would say to watch out for. If all you're doing is being a guest on things and you're not regularly producing content, there's really not a reason to get really fancy equipment. Just good enough quality equipment is kind of where it goes. Yeah, so that kind of goes over all the tech stuff. It's pretty fun when you get into it, mostly because microphones are just weird and you can have all kinds of weird settings and make some fun sounds and stuff on them. And also when you sort of go through the process of where we started with just really trash microphones, it's really neat to hear the audio difference starting from those Skype mics headsets we started with to now most of us are using Yetis or Blue Snowballs. So that's pretty much almost all of us. Yeah, so that kind of covers technology. So if folks have questions, they can obviously throw questions out about that. I'm happy to answer those. Now I kind of want to switch over to talking about like making podcasts, because some people may be interested in creating their own shows, and that can seem like a pretty daunting task for folks. Really, I kind of have just like a bunch of rules that I think of when it comes to making your own podcast. The kind of number one is really just to figure out what you want to do. And even if that's just you want to kind of do a little bit of mimicry as a starting point, that's perfectly fine. You just need to figure out what it is that you want. The kind of worst thing to do is to like go into making a podcast having no idea what you're doing, and then you just record a bunch of stuff and it ends up not really working because you'll just run into all kinds of problems where things just aren't working the way that they should. So figure out what you want to do. What kind of show is it? Is it going to be a book discussion podcast? Is it going to be you talking about, as Bob was mentioning in the comments, how much they love disco and just like giving us a rundown of great disco tunes? Whatever it happens to be, figure out the format that it is that you want. For us, it was really simple. When we started, there weren't a whole lot of science fiction podcasts at all. There were, I think, maybe 3 that were sort of notable, and maybe a handful other than that that nobody really knew about. And so it for us, it kind of really came down to what we wanted to add to the conversation because we liked the way that the podcast format worked. It also, for Jen and I, was a way for us to stay in touch. And then eventually it became a whole bunch of other people got, sort of sucked into our vortex and became part of the show. And so really we kind of started with, there wasn't a lot of variety to work from. So we said, well, we'll do these things. And since then we've sort of added things. So like Torture Cinema was a sort of new one because we wanted to talk about some of the terrible science fiction movies and have fun. And we've added other things like movie and television conversations, etc. So those are the things that we kind of started from. These days, there are just so many podcasts. I mean, if you think of like Star Wars podcasting, there are, I don't know how many of them there are, like dozens upon dozens. And a lot of them are very much kind of the same show. My favorite is Aggressive Negotiations. I really enjoy that show quite a lot because they get into the real sort of nitty gritty and of analysis of Star Wars, but in a fairly positive way. So I listen to that show because they offer some things a little bit different than a lot of the others, which is just sort of general conversation about Star Wars. So if you were making a Star Wars podcast, you'd probably want to think about what is it that we're doing that's different than other people, even if it's something specific. So maybe it's a Star Wars podcast from a diverse perspective, because there are some, but there didn't used to be really any. Great. Then you may be doing similar content, but you're taking it from a different perspective. So that's like the number one. Start from what is it you want to do? What is the gap that you're filling, right? What makes you unique? Even if it's something really simple, that's okay. Then start with by prepping intros. What is your intro going to be? What's your outro going to be? So you have some degree of consistency. You can change them later, but if you listen to the Skiffy and Fanty show, we have a intro and an outro that is pretty consistent across the board. And we kept it that way for quite a while now. But it helps because it provides a kind of simplistic structure to what you're doing. Then just recognize that you're going to suck. The first few episodes you make, they're going to be terrible. The first episodes we made for this podcast, I have not listened to them again in almost 10 years, which is as long as we've been on the air, whatever you want to call it. But the reality is the first few podcasts you make are just, they're going to suck a bit. I mean, unless you've got like a crew behind you helping to produce the show, which most people don't have, you're just going to it's going to take some time to kind of get into it, figure it out. So listen to yourself, make adjustments, be willing to hear what other people have to say about your podcast. The first things we ran into when we started recording was the recorder we used put the audio tracks side by side. And so you'd have audio in left ear, audio in right ear, different voices. I didn't realize at the start that it was doing that. And so it took someone pointing it out that that's what was going on. And we realized we needed to split the stereo track into monos so that it would be evened out. So that's a thing just to keep in mind. That's going to happen. If you're new to it, it's just going to take some adjustment period. If you're really nervous about it, make some shows just as a test case, listen to it, kind of criticize yourself and go, okay, I'm going to make these adjustments and then start again. So there. And then a couple of things in terms of the different types of shows. So there are sort of 2 groupings of podcasts. There's what I would say are freeform shows. Those are like the talk shows where someone's just babbling about, a bunch of people babbling about a topic, and there is limited amounts of structure. My recommendation for that is to always have some established clear goals or topics that you know you're going to cover, or at least a time limit that you've established yourself even if it's a little fuzzy. We usually try to keep our recordings less than an hour and 15 minutes in our total recording time so that we can produce that into something that's closer to 45 or 50 minutes. Because we use a mostly free format for our conversations. We have a topic that's focused, so we'll talk about a movie, for example, and then that's kind of it. We don't really talk about anything else. We stay pretty focused on that, and then we usually cut ourselves off, which means we don't get to everything. We only get to some things. For more structured shows, those are the shows that are more scripted. So I was thinking Words to That Effect would be a podcast that does this a lot, which is every episode, there's a specific topic and everything's very clearly scripted out, that there's structure to the way that the podcast is there. And my recommendation for that is you just got to prepare. You got to stick to it, and you got to prepare it. Ad-libbing's fine, but you got to structure it so that you know what are all the beats that you're hitting, what are all the pieces that you're going to cover. So that means outlining, etc. I find that for us, because I'm a terribly disorganized person, freeform is just the more natural place to go. And I'm also a teacher, so I spend a lot of time yelling at people, not yelling, talking at people. I wouldn't work as well in a more structured show format, but some people need that organization, and that's what they want to produce. So stuff like Words to That Effect, or I suppose you could say Our Opinions Are Correct, is also pretty structured as well. So beyond that, constantly growing, constantly exploring, and for the love of God, actually listen to podcasts from time to time. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. It's sort of like the rule for writing fiction. I'm sure some of you have heard this, where people tell you need to actually read in order to be a better writer. It's the same thing with podcasting. You don't have to listen to podcasts literally all the time, but if you're never listening to what's going on in podcasting, you're just going to be stuck in like a bubble that never adapts and changes and evolves. And that in the long run is just going to do bad things for your brain. So for us, that's meant that occasionally we try new things. It fails miserably, and then we don't try it again. For others, it's, we figure out what really works and what's still pretty standard. We adapt our editing quality. We've been finding new ways to do that in the last few years, etc. So that's sort of important for us to kind of do. So that's what I would say, is just make sure you're listening to podcasts, because it's important. I know that Dublin Writer on Twitter asked about like making, how do you handle longer podcasts? And again, this kind of comes down to those different types that you make. So free form or more structured. I would say personally, I'm not a big fan of long podcasts. I don't know if anyone who happens to be watching is the same, but pretty much anything over an hour and a half for me is like, it better be the most amazing content I've ever heard. Because I just can't. Me personally, I can't listen to stuff that's much longer than that. So in general, if you're doing freeform podcasts, if it's over an hour and a half, there better be some kind of focus to it, or it should be in some way, there needs to be a progression that's implied. This is why you can kind of get away with it with story-based stuff like actual plays. Adventure Zone's an example. A lot of their episodes are either at the hour and a half or more length, but they work because there's a narrative that you're following, and so there's a sort of point A to point B that you're getting through. Whatever you do, though, if you're going to have a freeform, you got to make sure that everything that's going on is relevant and interesting, and keep your, I guess, tangents to a minimum. The more tangents, the more problems you're going to run into, which is an issue that I know that Stephen is here, so he's been in some of the recording sessions for Skiffy and Fanty. That's a thing we've run into, where we get into some like real deep tangents. You just don't hear them on the final recording. So yeah. And I know Stephen's mentioning that 20 to 30 minutes for a podcast is like one commute, one podcast. Yeah, for me, that used to be the limit for me. Is if a podcast was much longer than that, it needed to be really good content, because it was a commute thing. I had about a 15-20 minute commute. I used to. Now I don't. I basically live like almost inside my university. So, but that's the thing. So I know that John's asking about improving editing. Mostly we do lock Jen in a room, and we hook her up to a couple batteries. And if she doesn't edit at a speed that we find appropriate, she gets shocked. That's really what happens. Jen will confirm on Twitter when she sees this. That's precisely what happens. So yeah, mostly it was just learning new tools. Jen has been doing most of the editing the last couple of years, and so Jen has been adapting and bringing in new methods for editing. And that's been really helpful. That's a thing you just got to recognize there are new plugins for Audacity, and you got to play around with them and figure them out. So yeah, just to kind of go back to that about the long form, if you're doing structured podcasts, you're going to spend a lot of time preparing, and you need to be really willing to do that. And there probably isn't such a thing as too much preparation for that. So I also recommend like intentionally practicing. I know some people worry about like running into the problem of not knowing what to say, and you just sort of wandering through content, and then you hit those silent points. Uh, in my case, I'm pretty lucky because I work a job where I have to be able to work on the fly. I'm a teacher, so that's the thing I do on the daily, where I'm interacting with people and have to come up with stuff as we go. Um, my recommendation is, it sounds crazy, but honestly, talk to yourself. Like, pick a topic that interests you, and then just try to talk for like 20 straight minutes, wandering your apartment, doing chores, and have a conversation with literally nobody. You just talk about it. That'll really help sort of lubricate the gears, as it were, and help you become better at getting words out and getting sentences out. You can also do it like when you drive. If you have a commute, literally have a conversation with yourself while you're commuting. It's weird, but it does actually help. And you'll get really good at being able to think through your thoughts and on a quicker pace. And that's what I would kind of say for that. So yeah. And then if you're an author, I guess on the silence question, if you're an author, I would say I would come up with talking points for yourself, like a bulleted list or something. That would be really helpful. Because mind blanks do happen, and John's mentioning things like pauses and mind blanks. That's a thing that we all kind of run into. If you're an author, that can be an even bigger one, because if you don't know what the questions are ahead of time, you could get like stumped by something, and so you can't always protect yourself from getting stumped, because that's just going to happen, especially if you're dealing with us, because we're weird and we'll ask you a strange question you weren't expecting. But if you're practicing, it means that you might be able to kind of think about things a little quicker. And if you have like a list of talking points, you won't be stumped by the ones that you probably should know already. I would say that would be where I would put that. So that puts us through part 2, which is making a podcast. And there's like lots of other things that I could talk about, like editing your podcast, etc. I don't really think that's that interesting, but if people have questions about the actual processes of editing, I'll talk about it. But I don't want to kind of gum this down with a bunch of like technology and software conversation, but just kind of giving my feedback on things to kind of watch out for what you should do. The other thing that I was going to talk about was actually about like being a guest on a podcast, which I know some people here may be writers, or they may be thinking about being one, and then one day you might think, I'm going to be on a podcast someday. Or you might be a guest just in general, even if you're just not a writer, you're some other creative type, or you're just a dork like me. So some things that I would say, I would break this up into kind of 2 things. I would say becoming a guest is one, and then being a good guest is the other, which is sort of where the etiquette part comes in. Becoming a guest is pretty easy. For those that like have marketing teams and stuff helping them out, it's really simple. Your publicist is probably going to reach out and do some of this work for you. And you may not have a whole lot of time to do some of the other things I'm suggesting, but if you're a little bit smaller time, my recommendation is follow the podcast you're interested in on their social media, know what they're about, interact with them from time to time, because that'll help sort of that podcast will see you and say, oh, this person keeps interacting and they just sent us an email. We should definitely talk to that person. You don't have to do it a lot, because I know it's a lot of work, but it helps if you're actually interested in the podcast that you want to be on, because they'll feel a little bit more like you actually care, and it's not like you're just there to get PR points, which is essentially what a lot of interviews are for. The other is be respectful. Podcasts that conduct interviews do have limited space. We literally can't fit everybody on. This year, we're not doing a lot of interviews, but in previous years, we did 2 interviews a month. And if you're in the science fiction publishing world, that's, I don't know, what was that, like 1,000% of the number of books published a year when you add that all up. So it doesn't leave a lot of room. We can't cover everybody. We can't read every single book. We can't go over all of this stuff. And so you just kind of need to recognize that we got limited space. Podcasts may pick specific people based on arbitrary things, like things that interest them or whatever. So you're not always going to get on them. Don't always expect a reply either. I would say that with Skiffy and Fanty, we get hundreds of emails, sometimes almost in the same month, and it's really hard to reply to all of that, especially since we're not professionals. We're not professional podcasts. We're not working for NPR or whomever or PBS or whatever. So we don't have like a team managing our email for us, and like we're just the talent, as it were. All we got is ourselves, and most of us are working other jobs, so it's hard to keep up with email. But don't expect a reply, but just keep going, and eventually, a lot of times these podcasts will reach out. Um, that's what I would say is becoming a guest. In terms of being a good guest, number one is having your audio figured out. I think that's kind of obvious, but issues happen, but make sure that you know how your microphone works. This is why I say using those simple like plug and go kind of stuff is helpful. Most USB mics are that way. You want to kind of limit that stuff and make sure that your space is quiet. Again, right, stuff happens, and especially we're all like living in a pandemic right now, and so some of us are living with our family members around us all the time, and so silence is hard to get it there. But like things like not having your phone on vibrate or ring so that it doesn't go off in the middle of a podcast, or trying to make sure that other people in your household know that you're doing a recording, and maybe try to set yourself a time limit for that recording. Those kinds of things are really important because it makes it easy on the podcaster's side that we don't have to do as much editing to get rid of noise. Other things, clear your space of all the sound things that you can get. If you know that you're a fidgety person, maybe don't set up so that you can tap on your desk and like make little drum noises, because that's a thing that some people are going to do. So clear your space as much as possible. If you've got off-limit topics, or there are requests you have, like you want to see questions ahead of time, ask about that ahead of time. Like give the podcasters time. With Skiffy and Fanty, we're usually trying to come up with a group of questions we know we're going to ask ahead of time when we do interviews. That's important for us to know that you need to see them, because not everybody is as quick on their head or on their feet, I suppose, as others. And obviously, if there's accessibility needs, we need to know about that. So Skiffy and Fanty has had a few people who are harder of hearing, and that can have an impact on recording and how we have to go about it. In those cases, a lot of time it means that we offer the questions we're going to ask well in advance, so that they knew those questions were coming, so that they were better able to respond, versus what we would normally do, which is they wouldn't have any idea what the questions are. So accessibility issues are a thing that most podcasts are willing to deal with. Not deal with is the wrong word. Most podcasts are willing to accommodate is the word I'm looking for. So make sure they all know that. The other one, actually answer questions. I know this seems obvious, but we've had a few in the past where people didn't answer questions. We'd ask questions, and the answer we get would just be the most generic statements or almost outright refusals to answer questions. And it's not like we were asking controversial questions. They were just like questions that were about content in the book that we read. And if you're not answering questions, that makes that interview like real difficult. I can tell you we don't interview a whole lot of people anymore, but when we did, I mean, it only happened a couple of times, but like a couple of people we just didn't invite back, because when we tried to ask questions, it was like pulling teeth. We couldn't get an answer, and it would be like over simple things of like, tell us about the setting of the book, and they would be like, oh well, I just don't really want to talk about that. Well, that's not helpful for a podcast. If you're going to do interviews about a book or a comic book or whatever it is you're doing, you really kind of need to be willing to answer questions, unless there's a very specific reason you're not willing to answer certain questions. And that just comes down to like a basic. So if there's topics that are in your book that you really don't feel comfortable talking about on a personal level, that's fine. Then that's okay. But if we can't even talk about very basic things in the book and get any kind of answer that is an actual answer, that's a problem. For most people, that's not an issue, because most authors are pretty easy to talk about what is happening in their book, etc. But there's like a weird like defensiveness for some people, I think, about having to actually talk about what's in their work, and that's just not helpful. And I don't think that's always about nervousness. I think it's somewhat about defensiveness. So that's a thing I think you should be aware of if you're any kind of creative, is you got to be willing to answer questions. That's just what it comes down to. Obviously, be respectful. Unless you're being disrespected. If somebody is being rude to you, honestly, I would just say bail and go do something else. I've not heard of it happening very often. I'm sure it happens more because podcasting is pretty widespread, but it's not something that's ever happened on our show where someone has been disrespectful to us on the podcast. And while we do screw up from time to time, I don't think that on our podcast we've been fairly disrespectful to guests. So it's not something that's happened to us, but occasionally it happens on other shows where people do bail. You should uh, be secure in the idea that if you are super uncomfortable in an interview, it's okay to bail. If somebody's like crossing lines or being disrespectful, just go. That's just kind of the way it is. The other is like, don't be annoying. I realize that seems obvious, but kind of read the room a little bit and know what kind of show you're on. If it's a very serious show, they're probably not gonna want to like get into, I don't know, like doing impressions of your favorite characters from Barney. And you just kind of keep that in mind. But try not to be annoying. Last thing I would say for an etiquette thing is really for anybody is try to have fun. Most podcasts try to make things comfortable. And so for you, it should really be about like, I've got this opportunity to talk about a thing I care about. I'm going to try to have a little bit of fun. That's great. Like Mike Cole has been on our podcast three times, four times, I think four times now. And we've got like running jokes every time he's been on. There's running gags that have been mentioned in another of those podcasts. We kind of talk about silly things. We have a little bit of fun, and we talk about the work. Part of that's because we've had him on so many times, and so we've sort of built a little bit of a rapport. But really, like I think Mike has fun on the podcast, and that's really important because it makes you come off a lot better if you are trying to have fun, keeping in mind that people have anxiety, etc. And so not everybody's going to be laughy giggly, and that's perfectly fine. So that's kind of what I've got. I mean, I could go on about other stuff, but do people have specific questions that you'd like me to kind of cover? Or it could be about any of the things we've talked about so far, or you could ask me general questions about, I don't know, making podcasts or making the Skiffy and Fanty show for that matter. So I do see that in comments, Stephen was talking about regarding interactions, I think, with podcasts about that some people on Twitter, uh, they thought that it was obligatory to promote their work on Twitter. And it's not really something that you want to do. Yeah. And I do think that there's a problem on social media, especially with people treating social media as just a promotion engine, not realizing that just spamming your link all over the place is not really good promotion. This has been a weird thing I've been getting the last like 2 weeks, which has been people who just like randomly at me in tweets with a link to whatever the thing is that they've been making, which to me is not a great way to kind of cover that. So I do see that Bob had asked, you'll have Audacity recording or just one person. I'd mentioned earlier, but just so Bob didn't miss it, we have every single individual person who's on the show records Audacity at their own Audacity track, and then they export it as an MP3, and we shove them all together and do the editing after the fact. So yeah, so we do kind of cover all of that. It's pretty cool, actually. It works great. Yeah, you're welcome, Bob. Yeah. Any other questions folks have? Could tell you about all the weird stuff that's happened on the Skiffy and Fanty show, I suppose, which is a thing that we've got stories about. Yeah. Yeah, I agree, Joan, saying that most of the people who are authors on social media are people, not promo acts or accounts. I think that's really important. I don't think that people should treat social media as solely a promotion engine unless they're like a publisher, and then there's some degree to which that makes sense. But even publishers like do silly stuff, like the Tor Twitter account will post questions to interact with the community, and I think that's important. So yeah. I know Bob asking what I'm currently reading. I'm still trying to finish The Witches by Roald Dahl, and doing Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich for the class that I'm teaching. And no, I will not harm Paul this time. Paul gets an answer out. Weird stuff that's happened, funny stories, bloopers. I can tell you in the early days of making the podcast when we used to do Torture Cinema, we used to do skits, which some people may remember. I still love the skits because they were horrible and silly and ridiculous. But one of the fun things about that was whenever Jen was in a skit, she refused to read the skits ahead of time. I don't blame her because the skits were not well written, and usually I was finishing them 30 minutes before recording because I was having too much fun. But she refused to read them. So my goal every single time we did a skit was to try to get Jen to basically lose it, be incapable of completing a sentence in character, and then to turn around and curse me out over the just absolute ridiculous things I'd make her say. Really, my goal was, Steven saying you remember the skits. My goal was trying to find where Jen's line was. These days, Jen has a line. It's interesting to see what her line has become. But in those days, you could make her say some really filthy stuff, and there wasn't a line that she wouldn't that she wouldn't cross. It's very strange, but that's one of the things that we used to do. I miss the skits quite a lot because they were just stupid. I'm a little bit sad because we had a bit of a multiverse going on, which I kind of wanted to create a wiki for to explain. But alas, we stopped doing that because everybody was being sad and took it away from me. But yeah, we used to do skits. We've had lots of bloopers. I can tell you a couple of times when we've done interviews. So we've had the horrible event on at least 5 occasions. We've made over 400 podcasts at this point. On at least 5 occasions, we've had the instance where you turned on the recording equipment, but it didn't record, which is why we do the Audacity tracks too, because it both improves the quality, but also you can see the Audacity track running. And so we've had, on at least 5 occasions, had to redo an interview, which is really weird because you've already asked all the questions, and now that author knows all the questions, and you have to kind of come back and make it seem like it's a natural conversation about the book. We've had that happen a couple of times. Let's see. So one of the other things that happened, we did an interview with Celine Kiernan, who is an Irish author of fantasy. She's written a number of like young adult and adult fantasy, and she's worked in the animation world. And one of the interesting things that happened was for one of her more recent books, Into the Gray, I believe it was, the publisher had sent me a copy of the book, but it turned out that the book they actually sent me inside was not the same book. It was for a different book, the title of which I've forgotten. But I didn't know because I didn't look at the title page. So I read this entire book, and about 25 minutes into the interview with Celine Kiernan, I just stop and go, what the hell are we talking about? Because nothing they were talking about made any sense at all. It had nothing to do with the plot. And I kept going like, my story is completely different than this. And it took us a good 10 minutes to figure out what was going on until I looked at the title page of the book and realized, oh yeah, that because this is not the same book. And we had a good laugh about it because the publisher had to like deliberately put the cover for Into the Gray on a book, the interior of which was a different book. So that was really funny. We did a re-recording of that particular episode, which was a lot of fun. But it's a weird event that's happened. You can maybe ask Mike Cole about the salad bowl one day. We had a whole running gag with Mike Cole about being in a giant salad bowl covered in dressing, which is in all of our interviews except the last one we did with him. So you'd ask him about that. Yeah, we've had some like weird moments, to say the least, but not as weird as I think some other people have had. It's just more like weird technical things that have happened. So anyone else got anything? Anything you want to know? Stephen wasn't around for the skits. I just realized, Stephen, you weren't here for the skits. You just remember listening to them, but you never got to be in one. I'm gonna have to change that. We'll just have to do a skit just for Stephen. That'd be good. Awkward silence is a good, yeah, John, we're into the awkward silence phase. Well, I mean, it's mostly because I covered quite a lot, and I'm guessing like not a lot of folks have really anything they'd like to add. So But Bob has when should a podcast series end in your opinion? Well, there's sort of like two ways to approach that question. I would say that so I'll approach it from both ways. I would say if you're the one making the podcast, when the show should end I would say when the people making that podcast aren't enjoying it anymore, and the reason is that they're just kind of over the making of that thing. One way to look at that is if you start thinking of making podcast as just purely work. This is an issue that Jen and I have sometimes had because, especially for Jen, she's doing a lot of the editing, and it can sometimes be a bit of a drain if you're just working and working and making podcasts, but you're not necessarily getting to relish in the joy part of it as much. So I would say for the people making a podcast, if you start hitting that point where you're like actually burning out and you can't do a reassessment to get back into a love of that thing, that's sometimes a good idea, a good time to kind of stop making it. I would say from outside, if you're the one looking in, I mean, usually most podcasts that have like a very specific focus have a pretty specific shelf life of how long they can sort of maintain interest before they sort of fall apart. Not all of them have this. Some can stick around for quite a while. I would say once you've sort of reached that point in the making of the podcast where the audience is really not getting any new content, that's probably a good time to end that because all you're going to do is retread. Yeah, and I think Joan's mentioning in the comments that it's also important to remember to take a break to feel burnout. So the Skiffy and Fanty show, for example, we take off about a month and an extra week or so between podcasts for our sort of winter break. We basically quit like a few days before Christmas, and we don't come back till the end of January. We did that really because we just needed the break, and a lot of us were like going, in my case I was in grad school, and so I would sometimes go home to be with family, and I didn't want to lug all of my recording equipment, and it's just nice to take a break because burnout is a real issue. It happens to a lot of people in almost anything. With podcasting, burnout can happen just like anything else, and I think with that you just need to do a reassessment. If you can, step back to try to recharge the batteries. But if you can't, if you're just getting absolutely no joy out of it, like quitting is fine. I know Galactic Suburbia has ended their podcast. This year's the last year they were producing any podcasts, at least for a while. That's sort of it's on hiatus, but based on the way that they talked in the podcast, it seemed like they're sort of putting up the hats, as it were. I think for them, like they've had a really good run, and they could certainly keep going for a while, but their lives, different stuff's happening in their lives, and they need to kind of walk away for a bit. Maybe they come back, and maybe they don't, and I think that's perfectly fine as well. I think as podcasters, unless like someone's paying you lots of money, you should just not feel very obligated to continue to produce forever. You should do it because you actually enjoy it. If you're making money, that's a whole other nightmare zone. If you're making a decent living at making podcasting, of which most podcasters don't. So yeah, Bob's saying like a regular scheduled break can be like a summer double issue, gives everybody time for vacation. Yeah, precisely. And I think it's important because people need vacations as much as possible, especially like if most people making podcasts are just basically they're just doing it for fun. They're just a bunch of like dorks and make an audio show. And it's just kind of like one of those things, you can't just do that level of work all of the time and not sort of take some time for yourself. So it really kind of comes down to, I think in all things, you just like self-care is important. I would say that's really where I would put it. And if you're not sort of taking care of yourself, you're going to burn out a lot quicker, whether it's making podcasts or basically doing anything else. So yeah. Yeah, podcasting is the new live journal. Kind of. I mean, live journal, yeah, a little bit. Except that not all podcasts were bought up by like a Russian company. Isn't that what happened to Live Journal? It was bought up by some Russian company and then basically destroyed. I can't remember. So, yeah. So that's kind of my opinion on when podcast series should end. Really. GeoCities is dead, Joan. GeoCities has been dead for a very long time. Oh, I have fond memories of GeoCities. I used to have a GeoCities page. I don't know what the web address for that was, but it's certainly gone. So yeah, well, I've kind of covered quite a lot, and so I feel like a lot's been said. So unless folks have specific questions, I really appreciate folks coming out for this. Oh, Joan came one. What's with the weird ET poster? It's not ET. It is for the greatest science fiction 80s film of all time, Mac and Me. It is the greatest indictment of American capitalism in film form ever made. It's not E.T. It's not E.T. It is Mac and Me. Mac and Me. Look, Mac and Me. It says Mac and Me. You see that? It's Mac and Me. If for those that have never seen Mac and Me, you should watch it. Paul Rudd has been making fun of it for years, but it is a film that basically proved why major fast food corporations should probably never finance a film ever again. Yeah, Jonas, it says it looks like ET. That's because it was deliberately intended to be a ripoff of ET, but financed by McDonald's. And it features in the middle of it one of the greatest sequences in cinema history, and that is it is a random dance party that occurs in a McDonald's with the alien in a little teddy bear suit. It's pretty strange. So if you've never seen Mac and Me, I strongly recommend it. It's probably streaming somewhere. It might be on Tubi for free right now. Go watch it. Yeah. So yeah, it's not Kraft, no Kraft relation as far as I know, Bob. I think Coca-Cola may have had some money in it, but I can't remember. Yeah, and it is terrible, as Joan says, in that it is great, and I think that's really important to acknowledge. So, and we did a podcast on it for Torture Cinema, in which I strongly defended this film from the completely illegitimate opinions of other people on the podcast because they're all wrong. Stephen knows because I think you listened to that episode. Were you on that episode, Stephen? I don't think you were. I think you just heard it. Um, yeah, I can't remember who was on it, but it's good. Alrighty, well, here's what I'm gonna do. It's almost 3 o'clock, and we've hit about the time when normally I would end a podcast. So for those that are watching this after the fact, just as a reminder, you can find Skiffy and Fanty Show at skiffyandfanty.com, where you can get all of our podcasts. We're on iTunes and all those places as well, so it's easy to get to. You can support us at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty, and you can talk to us on Twitter at Skiffy and Fanty. We also have a Facebook group, facebook.com/Skiffy and Fanty. And that's kind of, I think, all of it, please listen to the show. We're also on Spotify, if that's a place that you like to listen, and thank you for watching this, and feel free to interact with us on the socials. And thanks to everybody for joining me, Bob and Steven and Joan and the others there are other people watching that aren't commenting. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining me. I will see everybody in non-video form in the future. So, peace.